In this video I'm going to show how I photograph sparrows in flight in a small garden. The camera I'm using is the Olympus EM1X combined with either the 40-150 f2.8 or the 300mm f4 lens. Photographing small birds in flight is never easy, and certainly a lot more difficult when they are fast flying birds like sparrows. Photographing sparrows in a tree or a bush where they are reasonably static is not that difficult. Most autofocus camera systems will lock onto static birds successfully, so getting acceptable portrait shots is not that difficult. Photographing them as they are flying is a completely different ballgame. In our garden we have an overgrown pyracantha bush. Sparrows love bushes and hedges because they give them plenty of cover from predators like sparrowhawks. When you're out walking and you pass a bush or a hedge, you can often hear sparrows chattering away. Because our pyracantha bush is overgrown, it's very much like a hedge, and because we sight our feeders quite close to it, the sparrows use it to fly backwards and forwards from the bush to the feeder. The idea was to move the cage feeder roughly 3 to 4 foot away from the bush and then photograph them as they fly towards the feeder. I initially tried to photograph from indoors. For this I used the EM1X and the 300mm f4 lens. This gave me a reasonable image size in the viewfinder. All I had to do was open the lounge door, poke the lens out and draw the curtains. I then framed the shot up to photograph them as they flew in. Using Pro Capture High, I manually focused 3 to 4 inches in front of the feeder. But there were advantages and disadvantages to photographing from the house. The advantage was that from this position the lawn behind the setup gave me a very diffused and natural looking background. The disadvantage was that because our garden is east facing, I was invariably shooting into the light, which meant the background was brightly lit and the sparrows were in the shade. Although I could rescue the pictures to a certain extent in post-processing, it was not ideal, so I needed to change the setup. So the alternative was to set up a small canvas hide in the garden on the other side of the feeder. Here I would be photographing towards the house, so I'd have the sun behind me. This meant that both the sparrows and the background would be well lit. To stop a small bird in flight you really need a minimum of 3,200 of a second, and even 4,000ths of a second or a 5,000th second is even better. So having the sun directly behind me, I could achieve these shutter speeds quite easily. The only problem I now had was that because I was photographing towards the house, I was getting a very messy and unattractive background. I positioned the hide roughly 8 foot away from the feeder. This meant that the house in the background was roughly 12 foot away from the feeder. Photographing at the 150mm end of the 40-150mm lens and shooting wide open at f2.8, the background was well out of focus, but with the brick wall and the white plastic of the window frame, it gave a very unattractive and unnatural looking background. Somehow I needed to change the background to give a more pleasing result. The only option was to introduce a false background. The background I used consisted of a large sheet of hardboard supported in the vise of a Black & Decker workmate. This hardboard had been painted green, and then I firstly draped some scrim netting over that, followed by some army camouflage netting over the top of this. Looking through the viewfinder at f2.8, this gave a relatively natural looking backdrop in comparison to the previous background where you can see the back of the house. So with the new false background in place, it was then just a case of getting in the hide, settling down to take the pictures. Although I could see the sparrows sitting in the bush, I never knew when they were going to fly in. Because they only had to cover a short distance of 3 to 4 foot, it only took them a fraction of a second to fly from the bush to the feeder. In normal circumstances, my reaction time would not be fast enough to catch the sparrows as they flew in. By the time I would have pressed the shut button, the bird would have already landed on the feeder. Because Pro Capture allows you to take a series of pictures before you press the shutter button, this delay in reaction time is virtually eliminated. I normally set Pro Capture High to take a total of 35 frames, 25 frames before fully pressing the shutter and 10 frames after fully pressing the shutter. Using this method, it's virtually impossible not to catch the bird as it flies in. With the camera set up on a tripod, I do not even have to look through the viewfinder when using Pro Capture High. I simply look at the articulated screen on the back of the camera. Because I have framed the composition to be a few inches in front of the feeder, I simply half depress the shutter button to activate Pro Capture, and then when I see a bird flying in on the back of the screen, I then fully depress the shutter button. I don't have to worry about the focus because I've manually focused 3 to 4 inches in front of the feeder. When using the 40 to 150mm lens, I was shooting at the lens' widest aperture. This was because I wanted a very fast shutter speed to stop the action, and to enable me to achieve a diffused background. The only problem with shooting at f2.8 is that depth of field, even on micro 4/3 camera, is quite shallow. The Sparrow only had to be an inch or so slightly in front or behind the area where I'd pre-focused, and the bird would be slightly soft. So a number of pictures you will find look very, very nice until you look at them on the computer and realise they're slightly out of focus. Despite this, I was still able to achieve an acceptable series of pin-sharp images. The reason I chose ProCap High as opposed to ProCap Low was because I knew roughly where the birds would be flying to, so focusing was not a problem. Using ProCap High gave me the advantage of a burst of 60 frames a second, which is essential for small fast-flying birds. I hope you enjoyed the video. Please check out my other YouTube videos, and thanks for watching.